Hello everyone. I am the storyteller. Tonight, I'll share a tale steeped in sorrow and stitched together with rules older than memory. It begins with a desperate young man alone, grief-worn, and searching for purpose who took a job most would never consider. A position at a forgotten funeral home nestled among dead trees and thicker shadows, where the air hangs heavy with rot and memory. They promised him honest work. Just bodies, just silence. But Andrews and Company does not serve the living. And the dead? They have expectations. So settle in. Let the hush of the embalming room settle over you. Listen closely to the rules, every single one of them. Because in this place, the dead don't rest unless you follow them. And if you don't, they wake. I swear I've been cursed from the moment I took my first breath, maybe even before that. The moment I came into this world, eyes scrunched shut, sticky with blood and vernix, wailing under the harsh lights of the hospital, I took something precious away. My mother, a vibrant spirit by all accounts, slipped away mere minutes after I arrived, as if we were two souls passing in the night, unable to coexist. Dad followed just a few years later, though I was too young then to truly understand the finality of his absence. Flashes of memory are all that remain of that horrible day, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, a fireman's jacket scratchy against my tear-stained cheek as I was pulled from the wreckage. They said it was a miracle I survived the crash, but even then, so small and innocent, some part of me knew the truth. Death had brushed against me, claimed what it was due, and decided to let me live, but not without a price. From that moment on, the specter of loss clung to me like a second skin, a shroud I could never fully shake. After the funerals, the pitying stares, the too tight hugs from distant relatives, my grandparents took me in. They did their best to make a home for me, to shield me from the darkness that trailed my every step, but fate, it seemed, was not content with the dues I had already paid. Granddad went down first, his weathered body giving out one sunny morning over breakfast. He was there, sipping coffee, complaining about the Dodgers' lousy pitching rotation, and then a gasp, a shudder, and he was gone before the paramedics even thought to rush over. Grandma tried to fill the void he left behind, but even her stubborn spirit couldn't stop the cancer that ate her alive, slow and merciless. By 16, I had become well acquainted with funeral homes. The cloying scent of lilies, the murmur of empty condolences, the way my suit never quite fit right around the shoulders loss was the only constant I knew. Somehow I made it through high school, then college, my aspirations always tinted by the knowledge that nothing lasted forever. When it came time to find a job, I was broke, unmoored, and utterly desperate. Maybe that's what drew me to the funeral business, a morbid fascination with the one thing that had defined my life. Or maybe, in some twisted way, I thought I could finally gain some control over the force that had torn so much away from me. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing in front of Andrews and Company Funeral Home one gloomy October day. The aging Victorian house loomed before me like something out of a nightmare. Paint was peeling from the siding, shingles hung loosely from the roof, and the windows stared out at the overgrown lawn, foggy with a patina of neglect. The whole structure seemed to lean forward slightly, as if daring the world to come inside and see what horrors it housed. I should have turned back then, should have listened to the dread coiling in my gut, but desperation has a way of overriding sense. And so I pushed open the rusted gate, my heart beating a tattoo against my ribs as I approached the front door. Before I could even knock, it swung open with a groan that sounded almost human, revealing my first glimpse of Harland Andrews. He was tall and gaunt, his face a landscape of wrinkles and liver spots, his eyes rheumy but sharp. His suit, while well-tailored, had a distinct air of antiquity about it, as if it had been hanging in a closet since the turn of the century. When he smiled, I caught a flash of yellowed teeth and gums receded with age. "Ah, you must be my new apprentice," he said, his voice dry as old parchment. Come in, we have much to discuss." I should have run then, should have turned tail and fled back to the safety of the sunlit street, but something in his gaze held me transfixed, a glimmer of knowing that both terrified and intrigued me. So I followed him inside, the door slamming shut behind us with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. The interior of the house was just as unsettling as its facade, all dark wood and dusty velvet, the air thick with the scent of decay and old secrets. Harland led me through a maze of dim hallways, the floorboards creaking under our feet, until we reached a small, cluttered office. He gestured for me to sit, then lowered himself into the chair behind the desk, his joints popping audibly. "I'll cut right to the chase," he said, steepling his fingers. "I'm an old man, and I need someone to carry on my work. The pay is decent, and there's a room upstairs for you. All you have to do is learn the trade and follow my instructions. Do you think you can handle that?" I hesitated, my mind whirling with 1,000 questions, but in the end my desperation won out over my unease. "Yes," I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain even to my own ears. "I can handle it." Harland's smile widened, and for a moment I swore I saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes, something ancient and hungry. "Excellent," he said, reaching out to shake my hand. His skin was cold and papery against mine, his grip surprisingly strong. "Welcome to the family business, my boy." As he spoke those words, I felt a chill run down my spine, an omen perhaps of the horrors that lay ahead. But there was no turning back now. I had made my deal with the devil, and the house had claimed me as its own. The room Harland showed me to was at the top of a narrow, winding staircase, the steps groaning under our weight as we ascended. When he pushed open the door, I was hit with a wave of musty air tinged with the scent of mothballs and old books. The space was small, the ceiling slanted, the single window looking out over the overgrown back garden. But it was furnished with antiques that must have been grand in their day, a four-poster bed draped in faded brocade, a massive oak wardrobe looming in the corner, a writing desk covered in yellowed papers and tarnished brass knickknacks. "This was my great-grandfather's room," Harland said, running a finger along the dusty mantelpiece. "He founded this business back in the days when embalming was still a new art. You'll be continuing a long and proud tradition." I set my battered suitcase down on the bed, trying to ignore the sense of unease that prickled at the back of my neck. There was something off about this place, something that went beyond mere age and neglect. It was as if the very walls were watching me, weighing my worth, judging my fitness to join their ranks. "Get some rest," Harland said, moving back towards the door. "We start early tomorrow. 4 a.m. sharp. And trust me, you'll want to be well rested for what lies ahead." With that cryptic warning, he left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. I stood there for a long moment, taking in my new surroundings, trying to shake off the feeling that I had just stepped into a waking nightmare. Despite my exhaustion, sleep did not come easily that night. I lay awake, staring at the cobwebbed canopy above me, listening to the old house breathe and settle. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes, sent a jolt of fear through my tired body. It was as if the very bones of the structure were whispering to me, hinting at dark secrets lurking just out of sight. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were plagued by visions of moldering corpses and grinning skulls, of icy hands reaching out to drag me down into the depths of some unspeakable hell. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my sheets damp with sweat, only to realize that the knocking sound that had pulled me from my slumber was not part of the dream at all. It was Harland rapping at my door with a bony fist. "Rise and shine, my boy," he called, his voice far too chipper for the ungodly hour. "The dead wait for no man." I dragged myself out of bed, my body leaden with fatigue, and stumbled to the door. Harland was waiting on the other side, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his eyes glinting with a manic energy that made me take an involuntary step back. "Before we begin," he said, pressing a folded piece of paper into my hand, "you'll need to familiarize yourself with the rules of the house. Read this carefully. Your survival may very well depend on it." With that ominous pronouncement, he turned and descended the stairs, leaving me to stare after him in groggy bewilderment. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, my eyes straining to make out the spidery script in the dim light of the hallway. The rules, scrawled in a hand that looked almost manic in its intensity, were as follows. Rule 1, close their eyes as soon as possible. If you forget, you won't sleep for a week, and neither will they. Rule 2, limb freezers must always stay locked. This isn't a suggestion. Rule 3, respect the last wishes of every client. You don't have to like it, but you do have to do it. Rule 4, stick to your hours, 4 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Mondays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday through Friday. Saturday is yours, and Sunday belongs to someone else. But never stay in the prep room past sunset. Rule 5, guests are allowed, but they need to know the rules too. No exceptions. Rule 6, stay out of the halls between 11 p.m. and 1:31 a.m. If you get caught, you won't like what finds you. Rule 7, power goes out at 3:36 a.m. sharp and comes back at 3:42 a.m. Do not, under any circumstances, try to figure out why. Rule 8, never investigate crying, no matter how close or how real it sounds. Do not look. Rule 9, if someone knocks after hours, don't answer. Doesn't matter if it's family, friends, or the mailman. Do not open the door. I read the list once, then again, my mind struggling to process the bizarre nature of the instructions. Some of them seemed like common sense. Of course I would lock up potentially hazardous materials, of course I would respect the wishes of the dead. But what could possibly be roaming the halls at night that I needed to avoid? Why was the power cutting out at such specific times? And what on earth could be knocking after hours that I wasn't meant to acknowledge? Part of me wanted to confront Harland, to demand an explanation for these cryptic edicts, but some deeper instinct held me back. A sense that there were things at play here far beyond my understanding, forces that could not be reasoned with or denied. So I folded the paper carefully, tucked it into my pocket, and made my way downstairs to begin my first day on the job. Harland was waiting for me at the bottom of the staircase, his thin lips curved into a knowing smile. Ready to meet our guests, he asked, a queer sort of eagerness in his voice. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. As ready as I'll ever be, I managed, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's the spirit, my boy. Follow me. He led me down a narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking under our feet, the walls lined with faded photographs of somber-faced men and women in old-fashioned dress. At the end of the passage was a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and pitted with age. Harland produced a large, tarnished key from his pocket and inserted it into the lock, the mechanism giving way with a rusty groan. Welcome, he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light, to the heart of our business. The room beyond the door was vast and cold, the air heavy with the tang of chemicals and the sickly sweet odor of decay. A row of stainless steel tables stretched out before us, their surfaces gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Along one wall, a bank of industrial refrigerators hummed and rattled, their handles secured with heavy padlocks. Harland strode over to one of the tables and patted its surface with a gnarled hand. This is where the magic happens, he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, where we take the remnants of a life and make them presentable for their final farewell. He beckoned me over to one of the refrigerators and produced another key from his pocket. With a deft twist of his wrist, he unlocked the door and swung it open, releasing a gust of frigid air that made me shiver. Inside, laid out on a sliding tray, was the body of a man. He was middle-aged, his hair graying at the temples, his face slack and waxy in death. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, glassy and unseeing. "Meet Mr. Wallace," Harland said, his tone almost fond. "Heart attack. His family wants an open casket, so we'll need to make him look his best." I stared at the corpse, a wave of nausea rolling through my gut. I had known intellectually what this job would entail, but being confronted with the reality of it, the cold, stiff flesh, the utter absence of life, was something else entirely. Harland must have sensed my discomfort, because he clapped a hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my skin. "It gets easier," he said, his breath hot against my ear. "You'll learn to see them as canvases, blank slates upon which to work your craft. He guided me through the process step by step, the washing, the embalming, the careful arrangement of limbs and features. His hands moved with a deft precision, a kind of reverence that bordered on the uncanny. It was clear that he took a deep, almost unsettling pride in his work. As we labored over Mr. Wallace's mortal remains, I found myself slipping into a kind of trance, my mind detaching from the grim reality of what I was doing. It was easier, somehow, to think of the body as an object, a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person who had once lived and breathed and loved. And yet there were moments when that illusion was shattered when I caught a glimpse of the photographs Harland had laid out on a nearby table, snapshots of Mr. Wallace in life, smiling beside a woman who must have been his wife, hoisting a fish on a sunny dock, surrounded by laughing children. Moments when I was reminded with a sickening jolt of the weight of the loss that hung over this place like a shroud. It was in one of those moments that I made my first mistake. I was reaching for a tool on the tray beside me, my mind wandering, when my elbow knocked against Mr. Wallace's face. It was a light touch, barely enough to disturb the delicate work we had done, but in that instant, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, his eyes snapped open. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Those eyes, once glassy and dull, were now filled with a terrible awareness, a panicked desperation that seemed to bore into my very soul. Mr. Wallace's mouth opened in a silent scream, his hands scrabbling weakly at the air. I stumbled back, a cry of horror tearing from my throat, but before I could turn and flee, Harland was there, his hands clamping down on Mr. Wallace's eyes, his voice low and steady as he murmured something I could not quite catch. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. Mr. Wallace went limp, his eyes drifting shut, his face settling back into the peaceful mask of death. Harland straightened up, his expression grim. "Rule number 1, he said, his voice soft but stern. Close their eyes and keep them closed. You don't want them looking at you. Not here. Not ever." I could only nod, my heart still racing, my mind reeling with the horror of what I had just witnessed. It was a lesson I would not soon forget. The rest of the day passed in a blur of grim tasks and unsettling revelations. Harland guided me through the finer points of cosmetic restoration, showing me how to mask the ravages of disease and trauma, how to create the illusion of peaceful repose. But even as I focused on the work, my mind kept drifting back to the disturbing incident with Mr. Wallace. The memory of those eyes, so full of terror and accusation, haunted me, dogging my steps like a malevolent specter. It wasn't until the family arrived for the viewing that I began to understand the true depths of the strangeness that lurked beneath the surface of Andrews and Company funeral home. They filed in one by one, a somber procession of black-clad figures, their faces etched with grief. But as they approached the casket, as they gazed down at the carefully arranged figure of their loved one, their expressions began to shift. Sorrow gave way to something else, something darker and more unsettling. The woman who must have been Mr. Wallace's wife, the same woman I had seen smiling in the photographs, leaned in close, her lips brushing against her husband's ear. "You look just like you did on our wedding day," she whispered, a queer sort of tenderness in her voice. "Like you're just sleeping." The others gathered around, murmuring their agreement, their eyes alight with a strange, feverish intensity. They spoke of Mr. Wallace not as a man who had passed, but as someone who was merely absent, as if he had simply stepped out of the room and would be back at any moment. I watched, my unease growing as they placed odd little trinkets in the coffin, a tarnished pocket watch, a faded photograph, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Harland observed the proceedings with a look of grim satisfaction, as if this were all part of some macabre ritual he had witnessed 1,000 times before. It wasn't until the end, as the last of the mourners filed out, that I noticed the book. It was small and leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age, tucked discreetly beneath Mr. Wallace's folded hands. Curiosity getting the better of me, I reached out to take a closer look, my fingers brushing against the cool, waxy flesh as I did so. But before I could flip open the cover, Harland's hand clamped down on my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man of his age. "Rule number 3, he hissed, his eyes boring into mine. Respect the last wishes of every client. You don't have to like it, but you do have to do it. I drew back, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions I dared not voice aloud. What secrets lay within the pages of that book? What dark rituals did Harlan's cryptic words allude to? But I knew better than to ask. I had signed on for this job, and I would see it through, no matter the cost, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the strangeness and the sorrow that hung thick in the air of Andrews and Company. As Harlan often said, with a queer sort of relish in his voice, the dead have their ways, and we have ours. The days began to bleed into one another, a grim procession of corpses and caskets, of hushed voices and muffled sobs. I learned the rhythms of the funeral home, the ebb and flow of grief and remembrance. But even as I grew more accustomed to the work, to the intimate proximity of death, I could not shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with Andrews and Company. It was in the little things, the flickering of the lights, the cold spots that seemed to linger in certain rooms, the whispers that echoed down empty hallways when no one else was around. Harlan seemed to take it all in stride, his weathered face betraying no hint of unease or disquiet. If anything, he seemed to revel in the strangeness, to draw some queer sort of sustenance from the miasma of sorrow that hung over the old house like a shroud. It was late one night, as I was locking up the prep room, that I first saw her. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a pale figure darting between the shadows. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but then there was no one there, just the gleam of stainless steel and the hum of the refrigerators. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a product of my overworked mind. But as I made my way up the creaking stairs to my little room, I could not escape the feeling that I was being watched, that some unseen presence was dogging my steps. That night I dreamt of the dead, not as they were in the caskets, peaceful and still, but as they might have been in life. They crowded around me, their faces twisted with rage and accusation, their hands grasping at my clothes, my skin, my hair. I woke with a start, my sheets tangled around my legs, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, like a child crying. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the direction of the prep room. I lay there in the darkness, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was no way. But the sound came again, louder this time, more insistent, a whimper of fear and pain that cut through the silence like a knife. I thought of Harlan's rules, of the dire warnings he had given me. Never investigate crying, he had said, his voice low and grave. No matter how close or how real it sounds, do not look. But in that moment, huddled there in the darkness, my mind spinning with half-remembered nightmares, I could not bring myself to obey. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the floorboards, and crept towards the door. The hallway was dark and still, the only sound the groaning of the old house settling on its foundations. I made my way down the stairs, my heart in my throat, every creak and whisper magnified by the silence. The crying was coming from behind a small door I had never noticed before, set into the wall of the prep room. It was ajar, just slightly, a thin slice of darkness visible beyond. With trembling hands I pushed it open, the hinges letting out a low, ominous groan. And there, in the shadows, I saw her. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, huddled in the corner of a small, cramped space. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. She looked up at me, her lip trembling, and in that instant I saw myself, my own face reflected back at me from the depths of her haunted gaze. I took a step forward, my hand outstretched, my voice caught in my throat. But before I could reach her, before I could offer comfort or solace, the world around me seemed to tilt and shift. It was as if I was seeing through her eyes, experiencing her memories, a jumble of images and sensations, of pain and fear and hopeless despair. I saw the face of a man looming over me, his features twisted with rage and something darker, something hungry. I felt hands on my skin, rough and grasping, tearing at my clothes, my hair. I smelled blood and sweat and cheap whiskey, heard the rasp of labored breathing and muffled screams. And then, with a sickening lurch, I was back in my own body, staring down at the little girl as she cowered before me, her eyes pleading, her mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my vision swimming. I wanted to run, to flee this house of horrors and never look back. But before I could move, before I could take a single step, I felt a hand close around my arm, strong and bony and cold as the grave. I turned, my mouth open to cry out in terror, and found myself staring into the face of Harland Andrews. His eyes were hard and glittering in the darkness, his lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, no kindness. "I warned you, boy," he said, his voice a low, menacing rasp. "I told you not to look." And with that he dragged me up the stairs, his grip unbreakable, his strength inhuman. He hurled me into my room, slamming the door behind me, and left me there, huddled on the floor, my mind reeling with the horror of what I had seen, what I had felt. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in endless, desperate circles. I knew with a sickening certainty that I had to get out of this place, had to escape the madness and the malevolence that lurked within its walls. But even as I lay there, even as I plotted and planned, I could feel the house around me, watching, waiting, like a living thing, like a predator stalking its prey. And deep down, in some dark, secret place, I knew that I would never truly be free of Andrews and company, that the dead would follow me no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to forget. Because in that house, in that grim and ghastly place, the line between the living and the dead was thin as gossamer, and the veil between worlds was forever rent asunder. The day after my encounter with the crying girl, Harland kept me busy from dawn to dusk, as if trying to keep my mind off what I had seen. But in every quiet moment, in every pause between tasks, my thoughts would drift back to that cramped, dark space, to those haunted eyes staring out at me from the shadows. When night fell, Harland practically shoved me up the stairs to my room, his face grim and set. "Stay put," he growled, his hand tight on my shoulder, "and whatever you do, don't come out until morning. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see." I lay there in the darkness of my room, every fiber of my being straining to hear even the faintest hint of a ghostly whisper, a phantom footstep. The house was shrouded in a stillness that felt somehow thick and watchful, and pregnant with unspoken menace. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart and the haunted wheeze of my breath. I imagined I could feel the house breathing along with me, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for something. The hours crawled by with maddening slowness. I watched the hands on my watch tick past 11, then 12. I thought of Harland's warning about not leaving my room and couldn't help but wonder what manner of horror was prowling the shadowy corridors beyond my door. In those blackest hours of the night, I must have dozed off at some point, slipping into a restless, feverish sleep. My mind was assailed by a barrage of nightmarish images, faces looming out of the darkness, hands grasping at me with clammy fingers, mouths gaping open in silent screams. I jerked awake some time later to find my room cloaked in the deepest dark I had ever known. A glance at my watch told me it was 3:38 a.m., the witching hour. I lay there, heart pounding, breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream, just the product of my overtired mind. But even as I struggled to calm myself, even as I whispered reassurances into the stifling blackness, I became aware of a presence in the room with me. A sense of something watching, something waiting in the shadows. And then I heard it, the soft, muffled sound of weeping. It was coming from the far corner of the room, from the darkest depths of the gloom. I lay there, paralyzed with terror, every hair on my body standing on end as the sound grew louder, closer. I knew I shouldn't look, knew that to acknowledge the presence would be to invite untold horror, but some terrible compulsion seized me, some desperate need to confront the lurking fear. I turned my head slowly, inch by inch, and there, huddled against the wall, I saw the vague outline of a small, pitiful figure. It was the little girl from the hidden room, her face buried in her hands, her thin shoulders shaking with sobs. I opened my mouth, though whether to scream or to offer comfort I couldn't say. But before I could make a sound, she raised her head, her face coming into focus in the weak moonlight filtering through the grimy window. Her eyes were nothing but gaping, bloody sockets, empty holes boring into me with an intensity that turned my blood to ice. She opened her mouth wider and wider, her jaw distending in a way that was hideously, grotesquely unnatural. And from that yawning void, a hand emerged pale and cold and streaked with gore and grave soil. It shot towards me with preternatural speed, icy fingers wrapping around my throat, slamming me back against the bed. I clawed at my neck, trying desperately to break free, to suck air into my burning lungs, but the grip was relentless, inhuman in its strength. The last thing I saw before my vision went black was the girl rising to her feet, her eyeless face split in a screaming, ravenous grin. I came to on the floor, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs like a caged animal. The room was flooded with dim, gray light, the first pale fingers of dawn creeping past the curtains. There was no sign of the girl, no hint that she had ever been anything more than a figment of my desperate, sleep-deprived mind. But I could still feel the icy touch of those grasping fingers, could still see those terrible, empty eyes boring into my soul. I knew in that moment that I couldn't stay, that no force on earth could compel me to spend another night in that accursed house. I began frantically throwing my meager belongings into my battered suitcase, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fasten the latches. I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could, praying that Harland was still asleep, that I could slip away unnoticed. But as I reached for the front door, as my fingers closed around the cool brass of the knob, I heard a voice behind me, low and rasping and filled with grim amusement. "Leaving so soon, are we?" I turned, my heart in my throat, to see Harland standing at the foot of the stairs. He was fully dressed despite the early hour, his ancient black suit hanging off his gaunt frame, his eyes glittering in the gloom. I can't stay here," I managed to choke out, my voice thin and reedy with fear. "This place. There's something wrong with it. Something evil." Harland let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Evil is a strong word, my boy," he said. "I prefer to think of it as purpose. This house, the work we do here, it's all part of a grand design, one that's been in motion since long before you or I drew breath." He took a step towards me, his head cocked to one side, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You have a choice to make, son. You can walk out that door, go back to your little life, your petty concerns, but you'll always know, deep down, that you turned your back on something greater, something profound." He reached out, his gnarled hand coming to rest on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my flesh like talons. "Or you can stay. Embrace your destiny. Learn the secrets of life and death, the mysteries that have been passed down in my family for generations. It won't be easy, mind you. It'll test you, body and soul, but in the end, you'll be part of something extraordinary." I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, my mind spinning with the horror of all I had seen and experienced within those bleak and brooding walls. The thought of staying, of subjecting myself to more of that creeping, clinging dread, was almost too much to bear. But even as I stood there, even as I wrestled with the choice laid out before me, I felt a strange and terrible pull, a sense that for better or worse, my fate was bound up with this grim and ghastly place, with the secrets and the sorrows that lurked within its shadowed heart. Before I could speak, before I could give voice to the maelstrom of emotions raging within me, there was a sound from beyond the door, a sharp, insistent knocking. The heavy thud of fist on wood echoing through the sepulchral stillness of the house. Harland's eyes widened, his grip on my shoulder tightening convulsively. "Rule 9, he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "Remember Rule 9. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak, my mind flashing back to that crumpled piece of paper, to the dire warning scrawled across it in spidery, faded ink. "Don't answer," I croaked, my voice sounding thin and hollow to my own ears. The knocking came again, louder this time, more demanding. It seemed to fill the whole house, reverberating off the walls and ceiling, shaking the very foundations of the place. Harland and I stood there, frozen, our eyes locked on the door, our hearts pounding in grim and fearful unison. The knocking ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only a heavy, waiting silence in its wake. Harlan and I stood there a moment longer, barely daring to breathe, our minds reeling with the implications of what had just occurred. Finally, Harlan spoke, his voice a raw and haunted whisper. "It seems you have more time to consider my offer than I thought, boy. But mark my words, one way or another, Andrews and Company will have its due. In this life or the next."